Welcome to Ethical Edge Insights, conversations with changemakers, a space for deeply reflective conversations with those shaping our world. Here we explore their journeys, their greatest challenges, their most significant contributions to date, the contributions they seek to make, and how ethics have shown up along the way. Join us as we uncover the stories that shape our shared future. So, Gary, thank you for coming and having a chat with me about your podcast, The Unlocked Moment. Tell me if I've said it wrong, because I'm known to get
No,
those
that's exactly right. That's
wrong.
exactly right. Delighted to be on. Thanks so much for the invitation.
And what's interesting is just on our little pre-call chat there, you were talking about how much you prepare for your conversations.
On
And
occasion, on occasion. So sometimes when I do a podcast, I'll do a lot of preparation. And sometimes actually now more and more, I like to do not too much preparation so that I discover in the conversation. I find that's a really good way to have a conversation.
yeah, so I was just going to say that, thinking about our conversation here, I was going, and I do it with everyone. I go, where do I know them? What's my connection that had me end up reaching out to them to have a conversation, whether it's the podcasters or the change makers? And I remembered our connection was back when I was promoting the book, Positive Psychology Coaching in the Workplace, and you
Mm-hmm.
comment on that. And I was intrigued that you were once, or maybe still are, a ballet dancer. So we had a bit of a comment or discussion about dancing, because
Mm-hmm.
I've done Latin dancing, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as parfait as you, but I love it. Like, I loved the fact that you could connect with people and not talk. And I
Yeah.
love that it was a real intimate connection in the dance, and you're not saying a word and you're not getting
Yeah.
undressed. I don't have problems with getting undressed, but it's like a whole different space, right? So
Yeah.
this is where we first met, and we've had interactions on and off since then. And that was a really lovely memory to tap back into. So I've spoken a little bit about you. Would you like to tell us more about you, and then we'll lean into your podcast?
Well, let's start with the dance because um, a lot of people know me now in all sorts of different ways, but I think probably dancer is one of my founding identities, really. I started as a ballroom and Latin American dancer at the age of 4. So it's a thing that I always did when I was a kid. And over the years, progressed into doing competitions. And then as an adult, I came back to it, having had a few years away, and went amateur and then turned professional. So I became, with my wife, who we met to dance together. We formed a ballroom dancing partnership, and we traveled all around the world and did big competitions in ballroom dancing. And along the way, did a little bit of sort of cross training in ballet, but my wife was a ballet dancer. And more recently, since retiring, we retired over 10 years ago. But I've been involved in contemporary dance. I'm on the board of a large contemporary dance academy here in the UK. And what is interesting about one of the hats I wear now as an executive coach is that there's a lot to do with what people call the dance of coaching. So when you're in conversation, two people in conversation, the dynamic and the interaction is quite similar in a dance partnership as in a conversation. So you think about, how do you respond to the other person? How do you connect with the other person? What happens when you're moving in slightly different directions? What distortions do you get into? I can talk about that in a dance partnership, but I can also talk about that in a coaching conversation. So that's really interesting. So I feel like I don't dance anymore, I haven't done for a long time, but it's still very real in my everyday. My day job went in a different direction. So I trained originally as a medical doctor, went to medical school, did a PhD, and it was in my late 20s that I had what I now recognize as an unlocked moment, but I didn't call it that then, which was a moment of clarity that this wasn't the career I wanted to do. In reality, the moment of clarity was you don't have to do this if you don't want to. So it wasn't, I'm going to do something else, I'm going to leave, I'm going to change career. It was, you are allowed to if you so choose, even if that means you're going to fail. You're allowed to do that. You have that control. And so I left medicine before practicing. So I never took my first hospital job, but I'd done all my training. And I went into consulting, spent 10 years in consulting. In my late 30s, realized I should get a proper job and moved into retail. So I worked with a couple of high street retailers, one a sort of mainstream brand called Mothercare, mother and baby retailer. And I also worked with Selfridges Group, the luxury retail group, global group. And I was doing that up to the pandemic. And in the pandemic, I had another moment where I really felt once again that sense of I wanted freedom. I wanted freedom to lead myself and not be led by others. And so I came away from an interim role I was doing. And I started the path that I'm on now, which is much more a portfolio career. Fundamentally, I'm a speaker, I'm a coach, I'm a podcaster, I'm a writer, and then from time to time, we'll go and do advisory projects, things like that, leadership advisory. But my identity now is in speaking and in coaching and in podcasting. Yeah, so that's kind of how I got to where I am now.
You know, it's curious you mentioned about dancing and leading and wanting to lead yourself as opposed to being led by others. And like even in the coaching space, there is this dance of leading or following.
Mm.
And I recall when I'm extraordinarily independent, maybe a little too much so. And and I recall one of the biggest lessons I learned from dancing was learning to be led
Right.
in
It's
without words. That's the fascinating thing, that you learn to read the rhythm and go with the flow of someone
mm,
else leading. And we do this in coaching. I think we have to switch in and out of learning to lead or to be led by the person that we're in conversation with.
yeah. So my wife has recently started in coaching as well on top of her day job. And we were talking about exactly this thing just this weekend. And um, you know, here's the thing: as a coach, you don't want to lead the person you're talking to. You don't want to drive the direction of the conversation. And actually, in ballroom dancing, as the man, your role is to lead, is to decide we're going left, we're going right, we're going forwards, we're going backwards, we're going faster, we're going slower. And so, if you've been trained in that mindset, then you have to put that away a bit because male dancers, or the dancer taking the male role, um, often are very confident, assured dancers because they're used to saying, I'm going to walk on the floor, I'm going to stand in that position, we're going to start when I say start, we're going to go in the way that I say go. And so you play male dancers into coaching and they have to let that all go and they have to follow. But then we were talking about the role of the female partner or the person playing the female role in the dance partnership. Followership, and you'll know this well as a dancer, is not a passive thing. The
Mm-mm.
follower does not, she's not like a shopping trolley where she's sort of pushed to the side, pushed to go backwards, pushed to come forwards. There's an impulse, a direction to start, and then the female dancer will make much more of that. So you'll see this in ballet or contemporary or in ballroom dancing and Latin American dancing. The man might give the most subtle leading impulse. The audience might not even see that he did it.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman will take that and make 10 times more. So will create this shape, create this position. And I think that's really interesting in coaching too, that, you know, you're not leading. So you're not saying where we're going to go next in the conversation is to this place. But if they go, I want to dig into this thing, it's okay as the coach to find ways to expand that. So that's, for example, how do you look at this problem through three different lenses you hadn't thought of? What are other things that you haven't considered here? That's all part of that expansion. And I think that a lot of coaches who have a bit of imposter syndrome, and I see and I work with some coaches who suffer quite a bit from imposter syndrome in their role as coaches. Part of it is because I think they feel a bit like they're not allowed to lead, and therefore the only alternative is to be passive. And then they wonder whether they did enough, and person they're working with feels like there wasn't that much value from it and they don't want to come back to another session. When you think, oh, okay, followership is an active thing, not a passive thing, it changes your permissions to coach in a different way. So yeah, I mean, it's just one example of how I think that my learning through dance influences my coaching every day. And of course, you know, I mean, I've been in professional coaching only since about 2020 was when I started my professional training. But I've been being coached from the age of 4 years old in a different way, but learning and growing in that way. See,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
It is. And I mean, what you're leaning into is this co-creation, and the way it shows up. And people often, I think, get fixed on what leading or following is. And yet
Mm,
it's so subtle that
right,
when you dig into it, it's actually quite powerful. And this is
right.
the co-creation. But the same can be said for the podcasting, which is we're
Hmm.
here to talk about your podcast. So initially, tell us more about your podcast itself and when you started and perhaps why.
So I started my podcast in 2022 because I was bored. I'd recently published my book called The Idea Mindset, which had come out in January. And I mean, writing a book is such an intense journey, such an intense process. So I hadn't had any brain space to do anything else. And one of my, sort of good friends who's further down the kind of this road than I am said, you need to understand the power of podcasting. And I'd never been really a listener to podcasts before I'd done the book. And I'd gone on a couple as part of book promotion. And I thought, this is fascinating, a space where you can have any conversation and there's no time limit and there's no like urgency to it. Like a media interview is a very different kind of dynamic. And so, yeah, I thought this is a very interesting thing to do. I didn't know anybody. So I started the podcast, The Unlocked Moment. And entirely fortuitously, my first guest, who was somebody that I coached, turned into to an incredible guest for this topic. So I'd always been curious about people, and I'd always been curious about moments. I'm the kind of person where I tune into like the big deal stuff. I coach people on the big sort of change making moments in their lives, how we really transform things from here to there. I'm not so much about sort of little incremental change. And I thought back about my own career and I thought I've had key moments in my career and I remember where I was, who I was with, what I was thinking in that moment when I realized I don't have to be a doctor if I don't want to. I realized I should go and get a proper job and move into retail. I realized that I wanted my freedom not to be led. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to just see if anybody else had experienced that? So my first ever episode one, was with a guy called Sam Horton. And he was at that time a jobbing actor. So I'd been coaching him for free because I'd been starting out in coaching. And I said to him, I need somebody to practice on. Will you be my guinea pig? I'll do it for free. And he was like, great. And we've been working together over a few months, helping him figure out the path ahead. The question he was answering was actually a really interesting question. It was, do I pursue success or do I pursue happiness? And he
Mhm.
felt like people around him were saying to progress in acting, you need to get a bigger part, a bigger role, a bigger show, a bigger stage, win an award. And that's the path. And he went, I get that. But also, I'm not sure that that will make me happy.
Mm.
But then the things that make me happy, but then I might not be successful. And as an actor, if you're not successful, then you're not moving out from your parents' home. You're not earning enough money. I mean, he was working in a pub theatre for a few £100s a week, probably no more than that. And one day, we'd been working on this particular problem for a few months. And one day he texted me at 4 o'clock in the morning and he said, I've got it. I want to pursue happiness. What do you think? Expecting me to pick up that text when I woke up. And I happened to be, I think I had my pings on my phone or something. So I woke up and I replied and I just said yes, which is a very non-coaching thing to say. And he said, why are you so sure? And I said, because it's 4 in the morning and it's
Mm.
important enough for you that you've texted me.
Mm.
And I came away from that and I thought, that's an unlocked moment. That
Mm.
was when I named it. That's an unlocked moment. So I asked him to come on the podcast and tell that story. So he did, and he was a brilliant storyteller. He came back 2.5 years later to do the and what happened next. And I said to him, so you chose to pursue happiness and to make choices. It was if I if it will make me happy to audition for the show, I'll audition. And when I audition, I'll audition with the song that makes me happy, not with the song that I think they want to hear me sing. And of course, surprise, surprise, he showed up as his authentic self. He showed up as a person who was um, inspiring to others, and success followed. And right now, he's in the ensemble cast of Phantom in the West End, and
There
it's his
you
biggest ever role.
go. And he's happy.
And he's happy. And he traces it back to an unlocked moment at 4 o'clock in the morning where he went, I know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So that was the origin of the podcast. And over the years, as often happens with podcasts, you build your little audience, and mine is a little audience, but a very, very high quality select audience. But the guests that you are able to bring on, the bigger and better guests will look and say, how many episodes have you done? Can I listen to an episode? Can I listen to somebody who I think might be a little bit like me? So as you get a good guest, that means that other good guests will come on. And so over the years, I mean, I'm just probably later today about to publish episode 160, which is with Rory Catherine Jones, the former BBC technology correspondent, which is a really powerful conversation I'll tell you about in a bit. Um, but I've had an astronaut, and I've had a Nobel Prize winner, and I've had an Olympic gold medalist. But I've also had a lot of what I call ordinary people with extraordinary stories. It is a podcast about people. It's a podcast about curiosity. It's a podcast more than anything really about purpose. It's about discovering your deepest underlying sense of purpose, which connects back to these stories that people have. It's becoming a podcast about leadership because in reality in 2025, I think that there's a really important connection in human leadership between purpose and authenticity and how you lead. And I'm doing a keynote on Friday of this week at the University of Cambridge where it's called something like The Unlock Moment, Why Human Leadership is More Important Than Ever in the Age of AI. And in the keynote, I am playing little clips from guests on the podcast who are themselves CEOs or leaders in their field, talking about their moments of clarity, which may or may not be anything to do with their work, but it helps define who they are. And it's for an audience of mid-career leaders doing the executive MBA program. So it's become a thing that I never set out for it to become. And I didn't start the Unlock Moment with a plan that it was going to be 160 episodes. I didn't start it expecting to discover some of the things I discovered along the way. So it's been an incredible journey, and still is every day.
What's interesting to hear is that you are sensing that it's a pivot happening in your podcasting now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so it's going to be a bit more tailored to one, maybe not to one particular audience, or is that what you mean? But it's certainly going to be talking about stories of leadership, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, so I hate the idea of pigeonholing, and so I explicitly didn't want to create a podcast that was for a particular audience talking about just one topic. So, there's a huge variety of different subjects that people will talk about and continue to do. But I think that what my work is becoming, my non-podcasting work is becoming more and more and more about leadership. And so what I do is I pull out some of those stories that speak to leaders. Maybe they're by leaders, but also they're by people who've got an important message for leaders. So I think that's kind of the connection through. And I think that the podcast also becomes a platform. So it's part of a platform. You know, I mean, there are some people who successfully monetize their podcast, but most people don't. The podcast itself is an anchor for what you do, and I think that that's how I think about the Unlocked Moment. I think that the thing that's really changed over time is, the early episodes, I was talking to people about their stories, and I still am. But I think the thing that I really didn't expect to see and has come through in a way that I just never anticipated is that I started to see these connections. When you've talked to hundred and something people about these powerful stories in their moment, in their conversations, you start to hone in on specific questions that unlock the story. And I found three. So, and when I do keynotes and when I talk to people about the unlocked moment, and when I sketch out the future book called The Unlocked Moment, it's these three questions. So the first question is, in order to understand the person you are today, where we need to start in your story? And that's a slightly different question from where do we need to start in your story? Some people will say, in order to understand the person I am today, you need to know what happened to me when I was 4 years old. Some people say, in order to understand the person I am today, you need to understand, for me, that I left medicine at 27. You don't need to understand so much about what happened before then. Some people will say, well, I can tell you a story from last year because it all changed last year when I was diagnosed with blah. The second question is, what's a remarkable moment of clarity in your life or career where you suddenly remember where you were, who you were with, what you were thinking when your unlocked moment happened? So that is explicitly the unlocked moment. Sometimes those two are the same time. They start at their unlocked moment, but sometimes they will start earlier and then they will come to this moment of clarity. Both of those stories that they tell, they could choose any story, but they choose those ones. And sometimes those stories that they tell are stories they've told a lot. But sometimes when I ask those questions, they'll think in the moment. And this makes for some of the most powerful podcasting. And they will say, I've never thought that much about this moment. But now you ask me that question. Actually, it's this conversation I had with my dad when I was 12 years old. And he said this thing to me, and I thought that thing. And I knew this thing I didn't know before. The third question is, what is the connection between the thing you do now or who you are now and those two stories? And that is an incredibly powerful question because sometimes the answer is not what they expected it to be. So I was talking to a guy who's a top coach, a world-leading coach, but he was a senior executive before. And when I talked to him earlier in the conversation about his purpose, he said a very coach-like thing, which was, my purpose is to help people unlock their potential, leaders, And then I asked him those questions about those stories, and he was always talking about his family. He said, I remember sitting on top of a cliff looking out over the sea, I think, with my wife talking about the future. And another story is about our family. And I said to him, well, it's interesting because you tell me your purpose is about the people you work with, but your stories are about family, And I said, I wonder whether that reaches to a deeper underlying sense of purpose, which is about family. He said, I think you might be right. There's somebody else I was interviewing, a guy called Dean Miles, fascinating. So he's also now a world leading coach, but he was a senior sales executive in a pharma company. And before that, in his early career, he was an undercover drugs enforcement agency agent, DEA agent in the US. So he worked undercover and then he left that world and went into pharma. And when I was talking to him about it, he was talking about in undercover world, he was helping people connect with like the truth of what is right and good. And he said it was sort of good people that have made bad choices in life. And there was something about facing into reality and being authentic. And then when he talked about the farmer world, he was talking more conventionally about leaders and developing leaders. And I said, well, it sounds as though that authenticity is really important to you. And he went, I've never connected what I did in undercover and what I did in pharma before and what I do today in coaching. But that is absolutely a thread. And so you start to see these threads. And I didn't see mine until recently. I didn't see mine until the last 3 or 4 years when I started going, well, so what's the connection in mine? And I realized that for all of the reasons I can think of and articulate as to the reason why I left medicine, in reality, it was a call for freedom. I felt like the medical career was a very constraining career for me. It felt constraining. It felt like there's a path. You do this role for a year, 2 years, then you do that role for a year or 2 years. it's a tight pyramid. So as you get into senior roles, it's a very small number of people. So you've got to play the game. It's political. And I felt, I just don't know that I want to be in that place where I'm dependent on other people to be able to succeed. I want freedom. Later, I could more explicitly see this that I want to become independent. I want to run my own businesses and also an articulation of freedom. And today I understand freedom as being part of my underlying sense of purpose. Um, so recently somebody said, you know, can we recruit you for a full-time role? And in that moment, I just went, no, because freedom. I'm very happy to come and do work with you, very happy to come and support, very happy to see how I can help.
Yeah.
I just don't want to be constrained anymore, even if I will be financially or career-wise less, whatever successful means successful. Freedom's really important to me, and I know that because you're tuning into these stories. So that's where the Unlock Moment started as a podcast and became a movement, became a thing. So people, I've heard people that have been on the Unlock Moment podcast on another podcast talking to each other, and they talk to each other about their unlock moments. And I go, okay, that makes me very happy. That it means something for them. It's more than a podcast title. It means something. Connecting with those really fundamental stories that tell you something you didn't necessarily know about who you really are.
Earlier we spoke about dancing, and that has not left my mind because we're talking about leading and following. And
Yeah.
I'm listening to you, but I'm also hearing the leading and the following.
Mm.
How do you think that plays out for you in your whole podcasting experience?
It's a very interesting question because um, you have this tension as a podcaster where, you know, you don't build and retain an audience if you don't provide episode by episode something that somebody wants to listen to. It can take you 100 episodes to build an audience, and if you put out one or two bad episodes, people go, well, that wasn't very good, I'm not coming back. So you feel under pressure to um, deliver, consistently. But then you also want that freedom. You want that sense of um, we should have the conversation that's right to have in this conversation. So my freedom plays out in the podcast where I just stop worrying about that so much.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I could build a bigger audience, I think, if I did a really simple, consistent conversation. I said, I'm talking to CEOs about what they did in the first 90 days, episode by episode by episode. And then I go, I find that a bit dull. I'd find that at some point a bit constraining. So the episode that I'm about to publish is probably with the most high profile guest I've ever had on the podcast, and it's a completely different conversation from any that I've had before.
Yeah.
So Rory Jones is famous for two things really. He's famous for being one of the BBC's top correspondents for 40 years. So if you're in the UK, you'll absolutely know who he is. You recognize his voice. You'll have seen him on TV. He was the person that was the technology correspondent through the birth of the internet and all of that. So he's helped us all understand, what that means in the journey, all of that. He's also famous because in lockdown, he got a new dog, and his dog was called Sophie from Romania. And she was a Romanian rescue dog that was incredibly nervous and spent the first 6 months of her life living behind the sofa in his house. And the BBC came and filmed Sophie, and she became an internet sensation. So he's got 350,000 followers on Instagram, and a lot of them now are going, your dog's more famous than you. We want to hear the story of Sophie and how she came out from behind the sofa and built her confidence.
And I could see your dog's ears there. They're trying to make
Exactly. My dog is very excited about what's going on outside the window right now. So, and then he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease quite recently. So he's got, he's dealing with that. He does a big podcast on Parkinson's called Movers and Shakers, which is again, really high profile here. None of those things are what we were talking about in the podcast. So I heard him talking about his upbringing. And
Mm.
he's written a number of books, including one on Sophie, that are all, big sellers because of his profile. And then he's written this memoir about his upbringing, his childhood, that he said it's the most important book to me, but it's the one that, you know, not many people are going to buy because I'm not that famous. And it's called um, Sylvia and Me, um, or it's called, I, I won't get the name exactly right. It's about his mum and the BBC and a box of letters. So when I'm talking about the unlocked moment, um, I talk about this idea of the box of keys. I've done that for a while. And I say, how do you find an unlocked moment? Well, you need to go to your box of keys, and your box of keys is stuff that just helps you to have an open mind, helps you to explore the alternative, whatever that is. It could be a story, it could be an idea, it could be a conversation with somebody. It's something like that as a key. So his story is when his mum died, he and I think his sister maybe helped clear out her house. And when they cleared out the house, they found thousands of letters that she had kept, letters that she'd written to people and made a copy of, or letters that she'd received from other people. And in the house was a box, was a red box, and on the top of the box it said something like, "To Rory, in the hope that this will help you understand how it was." And in that box was a pile of letters, which were the love letters between her and the man she had an affair with, that resulted in him.
Ah, there we go.
And the hotel bill for the hotel stay that resulted in him.
He was aware of this. That wasn't all brand new news, I hope.
He wasn't fully aware. So he
Yeah,
was aware that he'd
yeah,
become aware that he was illegitimate,
yeah.
but he didn't know the story. He didn't know who that person was. And so as he read those letters, a literal box of keys, he understood much more about who he was, who his mother was. And he said, I realized what a good writer my mother was.
Mm,
And there became this amazing thing about the origin of a storyteller, because in reality, what made him um, amazing as a journalist is he's a brilliant storyteller. And what he learned from that box of keys was where that had come from.
yeah.
And then he talked about his childhood, growing up in a single parent family and in a poor upbringing.
Mm,
And his mother had strived to get him into a good school. And he'd built this resilience through his own childhood.
mm,
And now, dealing with Parkinson's, that's coming to the fore. And then here was the kicker was he said, I'm really frustrated with my dog because I got my dog because I wanted to get a dog that would make me go out and walk because that was therapy for my Parkinson. But the dog that I got, Sophie, hid behind the sofa because she was that nervous. So I was frustrated that she wasn't helping me.
mm,
And I went, and at the same time, what she needed was a person to be persistent and help her to grow in confidence. And maybe in that way, you were the best owner that she could possibly get.
mhm.
And there for me there's the circle.
Yeah.
And I think it's an example of an unlocked moment, which for him was discovering this box of letters, but what it meant for him, what it told him about him. It's a completely different story from any that I've ever had told on the podcast. But
Mhm.
it is the essence of unlocked moments that he understands himself. I understand him differently today because I now understand that story.
Mhm.
And when I'm talking to leaders, here's the leadership connection. I say to people, um, you're going to, one of my dogs is pretending to die on screen. She's fine. Um, when I talk to leaders, I say, um, sometimes you should tell those stories because in reality, great leadership is human leadership, and people
Good.
want to know
Yeah.
about you and who you are and where you've come from and all of that. And leaders feel nervous to tell those stories. So
Mm.
when I'm in leadership or working with a team, I talk about the dancing all the time.
Mm,
And I'm like, because it's who I am, because it's how I see the world. It's because how I think about stuff
mm,
is the dancing is really important to me. And you couldn't understand me well if you didn't understand that I was a dancer, you know.
hmm.
So there's the lesson. And as I say, the podcast becomes my curiosity journey in people.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, I think my next question is kind of difficult for people to tap into, especially because, if you're currently recording or just about to release, that conversation's
Mm,
clearly at the forefront of your mind.
mm.
But if you were to reflect over your many, many conversations, what one really stands out that tickled you or that surprised you?
There've been many. There've been many. I think that I find particularly fascinating when I have somebody on the podcast where I know them quite well, but I know them in a certain context. And then I discover something about them that I didn't know. So in the early days, I interviewed this incredible woman called Hayley Thomas. And Hayley um, was somebody who worked in my team years before that. So I knew her in the context of jobs in retail. And I I can't remember why. I think I knew. Yeah, so she left mainstream retail and had started her own little fashion brand. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to hear about. I didn't know any further context to it. And so I talked to her about her origin story. And she talked to me about being this sort of budding entrepreneur, even as a kid, going around the garden centre and thinking, oh, I wonder whether I could make a business of these little stone statues when I grow up, kind of thing. And then she said, I'd always hankered after this idea of creating a business, but it was always now's not the time, and life was busy. Her husband was busy. They had children, young children. And then she said, and then one day, my husband was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer at the age of 40. And she said, and I'll tell you the moment, because we talked to each other and we suddenly realized, we've always been saying there'll be time to do
Mm,
this. Next year, the year after, there'll always be time. And she said, but maybe there isn't always time.
mm,
Maybe there isn't always time. And so her husband was going into, major treatment, chemotherapy, and and that was successful. So he's come through all of that, 5+ years on. Um, they started a business in the middle of that, in their home, to create an online fashion business, which means, sourcing product, putting it into your house. Your house is full of boxes of the stuff, packaging it up, sending it out to people. Um, with I think two young kids and, and going through all that other stuff. And she was
mhm,
like, it was the worst time. You would never pick that time to start a business, but it was right for us because maybe there's not always time. And I thought that's such a powerful message to other
mm,
people who are going, yeah, I put it off. I can put it off for now. I can put it off for now. This is somebody saying, yeah, not right now.
mm,
There's another conversation, which is my most downloaded ever episode 42 of the podcast with Micah Leibrant, who, if you're in coaching, you might know Micah. She was at Gallup for 14 years, and she designed all of the Gallup Clifton Strengths training and development for coaches. All of the Clifton Strengths materials and the podcasts are all headed up by her and a guy called Jim Collison.
mhm,
And I didn't know, I mean, I knew of her, very high profile in that kind of world. I didn't know her. And she posted and she said, I'm leaving Gallup after 14 years. And I thought, oh, this would be interesting, transition. So I reached out and said, would you come on the podcast? She said, I'd love to. So I actually interviewed her. This was going back about 2 or 3 years. Interviewed her a week after she'd left Gallup, a 14-year career,
Very fresh. Yeah.
really fresh. And I expected that she was going to talk about an unlocked moment as to why she wanted to move on and become independent. She's created her own coaching practice. She said, no, I know exactly when my unlocked moment was. And that's, for me, that's always interesting. When I say unlocked moments and people say, I know exactly when that was, you know, it's going to be good. And she said, it was before I went to Gallup. Her early career was in broadcast media in the US. She was on a path of building her profile. She was shadowing Katie Couric in the US media um, and being very successful. And she said, and there's one day I was driving and noticed the specificity because this is an unlocked moment thing. I was driving my 1997 Honda Accord along Rosa Parks Way in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I came to a stoplight that I usually stop at that stoplight, but this day I stopped at the stoplight. And this was 15 years before telling the story. And I was behind a Jeep. And on the back of the Jeep was the wheel and the wheel cover. On the wheel cover, it said, "Life is good." And I went, and I feel like mine isn't. And I
Wow.
need to do something different.
Hmm.
And that is a perfect articulation of an unlocked moment because I say to people, an unlocked moment is not a moment of action. It's not a moment of decision. It's not a moment of choice necessarily.
Hmm.
It's a moment simply of knowing a thing you didn't know before. So
Yeah.
sometimes you'll say to people, tell me of the times that are really important in your life. And they'll say, the day I walked out of my job was a really important day for me. And you go, great. When did you know you were going to do that? And it might be that day. It might be a week before. It might be, for one of my interviewees, he said 6 years before. I knew I was going to leave. I just didn't know when or where to, but I knew I was going to leave. And that was my unlock moment. For Micah, her unlock moment was, I'm not happy in what I'm doing. I want to be happy. And that path took her to Gallup, which was not a natural jump from where she was. It was a series of fortuitous coincidences. And she loved it. And she said, I realized I wanted to put myself around people who would grow me, which I think is a lovely phrase. You know, not I wanted to grow, I wanted to be in a growing environment, I wanted to be around great people. She didn't say that. She said, I want to be around people who will grow me. And I think that
That's a
that
very passive statement all at the same
right,
time, though.
right. And you know that idea of people say really profound and powerful things that they don't necessarily notice themselves saying. And one of the exciting things about podcasts is you can capture that and you can spend some time digging into it and just exploring it. Uh, Anna Martha, who's a top, you know, sort of public facing psychologist in the UK, she does a lot of stuff out in the media, has a massive following. She came on and she said, I realized that I didn't want to live my life as a half life. I was like, wow, what an amazing little idea, what an amazing phrase to share. I realized I didn't want to live my life as a half life. And that's the tune in. For people that are listening, and when people, you know, I do keynotes and so on, I say, find that moment. And you'll know it's a moment when you remember the weather, you remember what you were wearing, you remember who you were standing next to, and you remember this sudden bolt of clarity. I mean, when we're talking about this now, does anything come up for you where you think, yeah, I know what that would have been for me? That's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. I don't know if I want to go there. So when you're talking about sharing the story at the being at
Mhm.
the back of the wheel, looking at the wheel, and she goes, and I'm going, holy dooly, yes. So the thing that came to my mind was my former relationship.
Mhm.
And I knew, but the thing is, I can't, well, no, I can pinpoint when I knew
Mhm.
that this wasn't going to be forever.
Mhm.
It took a few years to then move away from it.
Right.
But I did know that
And, and
that
there's the thing.
yeah.
And I think that that's a really good example because I say to people, it's helpful, interesting for you to know what it was. Don't have to share it with other people,
Mhm.
but tune into that moment, because you often tune into the moment where you took action, the day
Mm.
that you quit your job, walked out. There's a guy called Tony Martinelli in the US where his unlock moment was in a meeting, looking around the room and going, "These people don't share my values," basically. And he got up in the middle of the meeting and walked out of the meeting and the job. And it was like that. It was so clear. He walked out of the room and kept walking and never went back to the company. When you tune into the moment of knowing rather than the moment of doing, it tells you something much more profound about what's important to you.
Yeah.
And as I say, often that thing is not the thing that you normally think about. So where.
What's fascinating is that you have found your own unlock moment. You've built a podcast on that. You're helping other people, even just through the podcasting,
Mm,
of them understanding and knowing their unlock moment. Sometimes they already know it and they share it. And now it's in some way, and is this passive or is it not? Because I'm still thinking about where you're leading and where you're
mm,
following and
mm,
what way you're leading.
mhm.
Particularly when you said as a male dancer that you have a much stronger sense of leadership
Mm,
than in the coaching conversation even,
yeah,
and perhaps even in the podcasting
yeah.
conversation. So I think it's a bit stronger in the podcasting than in coaching, that leadership.
Mm. So it's a really good question. I think that.
So it's feeding into your speaking now, into another
Mm,
career path, into your bundle of
yeah.
work.
So for me, I think the bit that is so it isn't is finding an unlock moment passive or active. I think it happens to you. You can't make it happen.
Mhm.
I say, and I hear this in the stories very often. When you think about, and you can think about that moment you just thought about right then. What was happening in that moment? Often it's I was walking the dog. I was looking out the kitchen window. It was a passive time, but brain, your mind was clear for a moment. And in that moment, you know, and I'm cautious about assigning neuroscience to it, but I think the mind can make connections that we don't actively make. And so that is important. What I think you can do is you can make space where that could happen. So you can, you know, find that clear-headed time. You can go out for a walk. You can just allow yourself to be free in your thinking, and don't try and force it. Don't try and go find it. The slightly more active bit is sometimes it can be helpful to find those connections. When you've told those stories, a bit like in coaching, the coach can notice things. I noticed that when you told that story and when you told this story and when you told that story, your family was always present. I noticed that there's this theme that seems to come through in everything you're talking about, which is about freedom. So sometimes that what's helpful in the slightly more active role that I might play is to suggest some dots that could be joined. It's not
Yeah.
for me to join the dots, but
Mm.
you can notice things that might not be clear to a person. And I think to your other point, what I'm finding now is I never expected, never planned for the unlock moment to be more than a podcast. But now it's a podcast, it's a LinkedIn newsletter, it's emerging to be a book. It's keynotes that I do. My keynotes are always about unlock moments in different contexts, so unlock moments and leadership, or unlock moments and balance, and unlock moments and freedom. And the beauty of having a mixed pool of guests is that you can tell all sorts of different stories with unlock moments. You can tell leadership stories, but you can also tell, you know, um, resilience stories. There have been multiple people who've come on and talked about health crises. There's been people who've talked about, absolute mental health crises. There was a chap who came on and he said, my unlock moment was when I chose to take back hold of the bridge that I'd let go of. And I was like, okay, let's go there then. And that's powerful, because now when people come up to me and they say, listening to this person tell their story changed my life because it gave me permission to think about that too. I feel like I didn't set out to do that, but I'm happy if people get that benefit, you know. And so, yeah, I think that in discovering these connections, I think the way I describe the unlocked moment is it's a lens that I didn't see before, I didn't know about before,
Mm,
about particular questions that help people explore parts of themselves that are not necessarily obviously accessible. It's not the stories they normally tell about themselves. Gives them a new lens on their deepest underlying sense of purpose. And that sense of purpose is not always what they thought it was. They thought that their purpose was to achieve success, to make money, to, to help people, whatever. And then they'll find, no, it isn't. That is important to them, but there's something underneath that that's even more important. And now I understand the choices I'm making now. Now I understand what I want to do next. And so in my coaching, with some of my coaching clients, where it's right, I ask some of these questions, and
mm,
it is new insight. And I've talked to a lot of coaches, and I say, look, there's no IP here. Like, these are just questions. You can use them. I tell people what the questions are. There's no secret sauce. Um, and you might find that you have a different conversation with people when you ask them, in order to understand who you are today, where do we need to start in the story, rather than start at the beginning, give me a potted history of where you've come from. It's much more intentional than that. So yeah, that's my exploration.
There's so many conversations, and I've had a few now myself this year, um, that has me wonder, and I've not come across it yet. So I'm wondering if that's just because I'm new or if I'm talking to some really lovely people. But it is about the challenges that might arise in some of the conversations that you have as a podcaster and
Mm.
how you manage those and work through them.
Um, there's a couple that come to mind. The first is, um, a great podcast guest is not a famous podcast guest, although it's easy to think that a great podcast guest has got loads of followers. A great podcast guest is a great conversationalist,
Mhm,
is somebody who's curious, who's somebody who doesn't have all the answers already.
mm,
Um, I would say episodes I look back on and I think that just wasn't as powerful. And it's not criticism of the guest, but it just wasn't as powerful. It's sometimes when they're very rehearsed, they're very practiced, they've got
mm,
a narrative, and they go on lots of podcasts and they tell their narrative. Particularly people who are on a book tour, can be a bit like that. They go, I'm here because I've got my 6 bullet points I want to get over. Um, the most powerful moment in a podcast is when I ask a question and the person stops for 10 seconds or more and goes, I don't know the answer to that question. And in my head, I'm going, and now I'm fascinated to know what you're going to say next. So I'm
yeah.
just going to give you the time. Um, what I started to do a few years back is I also started then to do the podcast live on stage.
Oh,
So,
really?
mhm. So I've done this in big sort of leadership conferences,
I love
and
this idea.
I've also done it at sort of corporate leadership events.
Brilliant.
And there was one time, and I remember I was working with a global organization. They'd flown in their global leadership to be in the room together, and the chief executive said, we could do this on stage with me. You could interview me. I could talk a bit about my story, and I think that would be really interesting to connect differently. And I went, that's great. And I said, I just want to name that sometimes it can be emotional. When you are, if you think about answering that question truthfully, as you did, you go, well, I don't know. I know what the answer to the question is, but I don't know that I want to say that in front of this group. So we talked it through beforehand, and he knew what his narrative was going to be, and he said no, no, that's fine. And so we had 20 minutes, and we're up on stage in front of a room of 100 and something people. And I asked those questions. And he talked about this story of a conversation with his father. And it was a powerful story, but then he got emotional. And
Mm.
I was like, oh, now I've got the CEO emotional in front of all his global directors. I'm about to be fired.
It's
Um,
human after all.
right? And whilst he was collecting himself, I turned to the audience and I said, I want you to appreciate that when you really tune into your stories and your authenticity, it is emotional, it can be emotional. And it's not powerful unless it's meaningful for you.
Mm.
So bear with us, but it's because of what it is we're doing. And people came up to me afterwards and they said, we've heard him speak before, and he is one of those leaders that has a very powerful, authentic message to give, but we never understood why it was so important to him, and now we do.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, thank you for helping to facilitate that conversation. That I think, I'm going to do that again in about a month's time and doing a big conference up in the north of England where we're going to do the Unlock Moment live on stage, and that is powerful. And in that moment, in front of an audience, I don't know what they're going to say next. So
No.
there's a pressure there, which is quite, I find it fascinating. I'm curious about how that dynamic works, and I'm curious about how it changes the story. You know, I did one last year where it was up on the stage with a high profile person actually, and I was conscious that they saw the audience there and
Mm.
that did affect the way they told the story. And they said to me afterwards, the conversation we had together in prep was more open than the one I had on stage. And I
Mm.
think that reflects a little bit on I'm still a bit guarded about telling the story. When so I think if you're doing that kind of thing, it's got to be the right guest who's confident, comfortable enough to be pretty open, because
Yeah.
that's what makes it powerful,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of, I mean, honestly, I love this that you're doing it live. It's just like, yes, that's wonderful. Let's go sit on a lounge and do it live.
Yeah.
It's just brilliant. I love this idea. So, what impact do you think these podcasts have had on you?
On me, it's fueled my curiosity because, you know, before before 2022, and in context, I mean, well, I was 45, 46, something like that when I started. So I had a 20-year career. I'd developed and grown and, and morphed and pivoted along the way. But I didn't really understand this idea of a growth mindset
Mm.
then. And I think that now this has been my growth because I'm not a great reader of books. I'm not a great reader of business books, anything, and leadership books, anything like that, or frankly fiction. Um, and so I kind of I gather input from talking to people.
Mm.
Um, I hadn't appreciated what I would get from um, connecting with so many people that I never would otherwise have got to meet. You know, I never would have got to meet an Olympic gold medalist and a Nobel Prize winner, an astronaut, but also all these people with their, the ordinary people with their extraordinary stories. So I think that it's become my growth, and I bring now. Um, I feel like more than I ever brought before because I bring just I talked to this person, they had this story. Oh, that's really fascinating. Tell me more. This kind of library now of stuff that is so powerful, and it isn't mine, and I don't want to claim it as mine, which is why in my keynotes, so my keynotes are unusual because it's not all hearing from me.
Mm.
So I'm doing this keynote on Friday, and at the beginning of it, I say it's really important that we ask better questions of ourselves, but I want you to listen to this guy saying this thing. And I've got this little clip from a guy called Topaz Adizes who came on the podcast. He's an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. And he said, we need to ask better questions because we we're always asking other people's questions. We're asking society's questions. We're asking our parents' questions. We're not asking our own questions. And only when you ask your own questions and really good questions do you understand what makes you unique. So spend the time crafting really good questions. And I was like, I couldn't say that better. You don't need to hear that from me. You want to hear it from Topaz. So I put this video clip up with this music behind that makes it sound epic and emotional. And I've played this time and time again. When I start a keynote, I start with Topaz. And people will go, I already knew 5 minutes in, this was an experience unlike any other keynote that I've ever been to. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, because I don't feel like you need to hear it from me. I'm not protective of it being my narrative.
Mm.
I feel like I'm a channel for other people sometimes to tell these stories and to unlock these ideas in people.
You're the channel. I sense that you're a bit more than that, though. I mean, it doesn't happen on its own. It's not a passive, I show up and I'm sitting here and then people unload on you.
Mm. But I
That,
think there's absolutely this balance where I worry every day about not manufacturing something. And there's a lot of very successful business books out there, for example, leadership books out there, where people have kind of manufactured something that isn't really distinctive or different, but they've just created something, given it a name. And quite a few people that I've talked to, they've gone, oh, you call it unlock moments. I call it crucible moments. I call it something else.
mm,
And I go, well, there might be that, but they're probably not. Because
mhm,
in reality, when I talk about true unlock moments, it isn't the same as what other people think about, which is often the famous moments. So somebody came on the podcast and they said, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I remember the day I got married. I remember the day my children were born. And I was like, they might not be unlock moments. What do you mean? And they said, well, um, an unlock moment is a moment when you knew a thing you didn't know before. Don't
mhm.
manufacture it. Don't shape that to try and fit in with your book title or whatever it is. Tell me the truth. Tell me what was really going on. I remember a very powerful breakfast conversation. I was sitting down with a couple, and we were sitting over breakfast, and we were talking about coaching. We were talking about unlock moments in the podcast, and I was talking to her, and he was sitting quietly. And the first thing he said was, I don't know that I've had one of those. So we're chatting away. And it must have been about 20 minutes later. He went, I know what mine was. And he said, I remember sitting in my bedroom at home. And I was like, immediately, this will be a true unlock moment because he started with something very specific about that image in his brain. He said, I had a conversation with my dad, and my dad said to me, I'm not sure you're going to ever make something of yourself.
Mm.
And he said, in that moment, I knew I was determined to do that. And he said, I've never really talked about that conversation. And his wife turned around and went, I think it was a bit new to her. Maybe they talked about it, but it's a bit new to her. And she said to him, but that's why you're so committed and driven to do the thing you do now, because it comes back to something really powerful and purposeful for you that you won't talk to other people about. And that's the thing when you have this kind of, you might never have thought about moment, that little moment of clarity when you went, oh, this is important. It's as simple as that. That can be an unlock moment. And I hope over time, you know, that this idea reaches more people and helps people, you know.
So, what do you know now that you didn't know when you began your podcasting?
Well, so I know for me, I have this clarity that I didn't have before about my deepest underlying sense of purpose is about freedom. I would never have described that before. There's lots of other things I would describe around, achievement or success or helping people or, all that kind of stuff. But underpinning it for me, what's behind all of that is my search for freedom and my desire to help other people find freedom. That's what I would say. I think I've also,
Or at least find out what freedom is for them, perhaps.
yeah, I think so. I think so because the word freedom means very different things for different people. Um, so freedom can be freedom to think, freedom
Mm-hmm.
to have an opinion,
Mm-hmm.
freedom to get it wrong, freedom to fail.
What's your freedom?
Mine is freedom to quit. Um, a long time before I understood this, the book that I always told myself I would one day write, I still haven't got round to, is a book called Quit, which is um, it's basically a sort of success paradox kind of book that the people you hear from are the people that succeeded because they've got the platform, therefore you hear from them. And what they say to you is, there was a moment along the way when I almost quit, but I didn't. I kept going, and just 1 hour later, I discovered the pot of gold, and now I'm successful. So, when you're really struggling, you should not quit, because if I quit, then I wouldn't have found my pot of gold. And then I was like, Hannah, hang on. If I'm digging a tunnel in a field in the search for a pot of gold with a rusty spoon, and it's dank and dark and smelly, and I'm going, I'm remembering those people and going, just keep going. It might be just 1 inch away, I'll get my pot of gold. I'm sitting there going, you might be 1 inch away, and that might be the right thing. It might be the pot of gold is in the next field. And you're not going to go find that pot of gold until you stop digging down this tunnel and start the tunnel in the next field. And it's just as likely to be in the next field as this one because you haven't found it yet. And so it's perfectly legitimate to choose to quit. That's not a bad thing to do. It's not a failure thing to do. It's a choice to do. If you do that, you got to take the consequences of it. When I left medicine, I knew that was a pretty one-way door thing to do. You don't quit medicine and then come back and say, hey, will you have me back? Because forevermore, you're tarred with the person who quit label.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I don't know. I genuinely don't know whether the next thing I will do, I'll be any good at. I don't know whether I'll like it. I don't know if I fail what I would go to do next, but I know that I can't come back here. Am I clear on that? Am I happy with that trade-off? If yes, go for it. That's the quit conversation. And I think that's my freedom now, that I feel I could choose to stop the podcast tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I have the freedom to choose to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Equally, I could choose to go all in and only do the podcast, and to try and find a sponsor and turn it into a very different thing. I could choose to do that. There's always trade-offs, but it's always in my power to choose. And there's a slide I put up in my keynotes where it says there are always multiple paths, but only you can choose the one that's right for you. And for me, that's the articulation of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. You've spoken about many stories. You are a storyteller yourself, and that's been lovely to talk to you. But I want to know who your dream panelist would be, guest would be. And you've spoken to some pretty intriguing people already.
So I tell you, and this is a sort of dream, and I really hope he's listening and decides he wants to come on. I'd love to have Simon Sinek come on the podcast.
Who, sorry?
Simon Sinek.
Yes, Mm-hmm.
Start with why and leaders eat last and all of that. And many reasons, but I mean, he's a fascinating person. He's a brilliant storyteller. He's also, how do I describe it? He's quite sort of openly vulnerable. He talks on his podcast, a little bit of optimism, I think it's called, a bit of optimism. He talks about his his way of seeing the world. He talks about neurodivergence. He talks about introversion. And I think that I'm fascinated. I'm curious about people. I'm curious about people who people think they know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in the idea that maybe telling this story, talk about unlocked moments, will show people a different side of them, will help them to understand them in a different way. That's interesting. I think that anybody, and it could be anybody, but anybody where you think they're one thing, but they're more than that or different from that, I think that's a really, really interesting guest. And it's a way of having a conversation that goes to a completely different place, like the conversation I'm about to publish with Rory, Catherine Jones, where people know him as the technology correspondent, people know him as the father of Sofia from Romania, but they don't know the man who opened a box of letters from his mother that told him who his father really was. You know, that they don't know that story. And that's the one that if you really want to know who he is, you need to understand that part too. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's my dream guest.
There we go. Well, Simon Sinek, we'll see how we go.
I give him a call.
Just reach out. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed this chat and your dogs showing up. My cat
Yeah,
did
exactly.
show up in the end.
Yeah, my dogs have been showing up and barking at anything that moved outside the window, but we're all good.
So any last words you'd like to leave?
I think, I mean, I would love people to discover the podcast. You can find it on Spotify and Apple, and there's a website called theunlockmoment.com. But I'd love you to explore your own unlocked moments. So think about those questions, you know, where would we need to start in your story to understand who you are today? And what's a remarkable moment of clarity when you suddenly figured out the path ahead? And think about, you know, you could have chosen any story, but you chose those ones. What is it about those stories that are the ones that you think answer those specific questions? That, you know, my pleasure is when people connect with those stories and find out something about themselves they didn't know. That's what I'd like people to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time here with me today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation.